So hi everybody, I'm Simon Briggs. I lead our practice for business model innovation, and I'll just give you a quick flavor of some of the things my team's been doing on ERIS and with the wider PFER program around smart local energy systems. So starting point for us is trying to make sense of this and trying to understand what actually constitutes a smart local energy system from a commercial perspective. So the reality is it's a collection of stuff, and a lot of stuff already exists. So really the sort of key nub of what we've seen so far is how people choose to organize themselves. And there's lots of different ways that's currently being approached. From our perspective, there's kind of four key components that we've seen within a SLES. So we've got energy markets, which is basically how you facilitate upstream into either local networks or national markets like TSO services, or potentially where the sort of DSO transition takes you. And there are many different approaches to that. In some cases, we've seen network companies largely lead that and try and integrate that themselves. But there's also more sort of open market approaches from the likes of Piccolo and their sort of market facilitation tool software, but also even potentially into peer-to-peer in the future, and allowing the local area to almost balance and set that market itself. The other sort of three key components we've seen then is on the energy service side. So that's how you sort of construct energy service and energy supply to local residents, and how that sort of differentiates itself from the way that the current market works, but also on sort of asset management and operations. So if I'm going to install new things, so new generation or new electrical loads like EV charging or heat pumps, how are those sort of gathered, owned, and operated is sort of a key aspect for how you start to commercially define what a SLES looks like. And then the final sort of key aspect is how you sort of integrate with customers and businesses and users, is how are you sort of prioritizing their needs. And there is sort of technology that's starting to look at that around, whether that's home energy management or building management, or even into sort of electric vehicle charging. How do I create a system in which the user is being prioritized, but also being allowed to deliver benefits sort of either to the local system or upstream. Next slide, please. So yeah, so the key aspect, I guess, for how a SLES delivers value is a lot of this stuff already exists. Some of these business models already existed in terms of the aggregation market. So I guess the key differentiator from our perspective is you need to be able to deliver on sort of three key bases. So one, give something for users, give them something better than what they currently have, whether that's through reduced bills or improved quality of service. Two is sort of a community angle though. So am I helping the local area improve or sort of increase uptake of low carbon technology, or improve their aspirations around greenhouse gas emissions? But then social value, I guess, is another key aspect. So is it helping address fuel poverty or vulnerable customers, or is it looking at issues around air quality? A SLES potentially has the option to address all of these different things, and those interests of the community need to be thought through. The other aspect then is system. So from a local network perspective or from a local generator perspective, I need a SLES to offer me something of more value than what I currently get. So what a SLES ultimately needs to do is be better than, I guess, my alternatives, which may be reinforcement or just trading upstream in wholesale markets. Next slide. So what we've done as a team is work with some of the different concepts and designs that are out there and start to try and group those and give a flavor for what they start to look like. And from our perspective, we've come up with 5 initial angles around the different sort of archetypes or approaches that we're seeing out there. 2 of those are largely public-led, where the local authority plays a large part in defining and leading what the project looks like. And then 3 are privately led, usually in terms of a lead organization is usually a commercial enterprise or something along those lines, or a special purpose vehicle. So if we go next slide, just to give you a flavor in terms of what those look like. So on the public side, we've seen sort of 2 different approaches, where there's something like the local ESCO model, where this is actually almost like a vertically integrated model, where a local authority will take on responsibility for asset ownership, local supply, and a little bit in terms of balancing the network. But ultimately what they're trying to do is focus on getting new generation in their local area that delivers value to that local community. There's usually a local energy supplier attached to that model, so they want to try and reduce bills and prioritize the reduction of bills for customers. And then what they'll look to do is potentially generate revenue as almost a secondary or as a byproduct from potentially trading upstream. On the local network manager side, that's much more about balancing than it is asset ownership. So I, as the local authority, I'm trying to encourage investment from local generators and then help balance supply and demand, usually through some sort of local energy market, or again, potentially a local energy supply model where I'm actually passing supply on to the customers or residents within that local area. Again, the focus usually is very much on residents and making sure that there's bill reductions, but also in encouraging sort of growth and increased generation within the local area. On the three bottom side, it is a bit more of a mixed bag in terms of the way that commercial enterprises have kind of approached this. We've seen something similar to the local ESCO model where a private enterprise might lead, and they'll essentially be that manager who looks at owning assets, about delivering reduced bills to customers, but then also acting potentially as an aggregator who is selling services into the DSOs and TSOs. The only potential, I guess, drawback of that is it needs strong local authority partners, potentially to make sure that the community interests are still involved. There is some concern, I guess, around whether a private enterprise would chase the highest price rather than necessarily deliver value across sort of the three key areas we talked about. On the fourth side, we've got something called local flexibility exchange. So that's more about market creation than it is about asset ownership. Piccolo and some of the work they're doing within Leo is a good example of this, where we're trying to simplify the process for procuring local flexibility and allowing aggregators to interface easily into local network providers. And then finally, on sort of the last side, it's usually something called asset-led energy services, where it's usually focused around big infrastructure projects like heat networks or sort of large-scale battery storage, where we're actually looking to tie a service around a specific generation asset or a large-scale infrastructure project. Okay, next one. So in terms of commercial challenges that we're starting to see as the designs are starting to get further along in their thinking and the demonstrators are getting further along in their thinking, is certainly there's this underlying concept around how open a market needs to be. And again, ideally in the principle of the way that Ofgem currently operates, that is what we're trying to look at and try and facilitate. There's still some complexity around how you make open markets within a SLES. And how you enable multiple parties to participate. And certainly this idea of where it's publicly led, how far the municipality takes ownership of certain aspects or the local authority takes ownership of different aspects is open for debate. Again, lots of other stuff down the left around how we commercially sort of structure ourselves. So how do you prioritize local flexibility if you're largely price driven and are just chasing essentially where the biggest price is or where the biggest market is? There needs to be some sort of local interest looked after to make sure that local interests are prioritized as much as where the best market is. And that certainly impacts on sort of legal and commercial structures. Inevitably, a SLES is a collection of partners, and how sort of the different approaches to doing that still needs to be looked at around supply licenses and how that works, and potentially some of the ESCO arrangements that companies are looking at. On the right-hand side, there was much more customer focused, though, than in terms of a SLES does need customer participation to be of value, and that's one of the key aspects. So if volume is key to making a SLES sort of cost effective, there's lots of work still to do, I think, around service propositions and how energy is propositioned to make this more attractive than what their current alternatives are. I think engagement is poor within the market, and that's sort of widely understood, and dissatisfaction is sort of widely understood. But this still has to be better enough to create some sort of customer pull or interest in participating. And two aspects that we're seeing that potentially stop that is very much around long-term contracts, and how if you're tying energy to assets and generation assets, it's very difficult to try and manage that, but also social value and how that gets quantified and valued. Okay, next slide. So right, in terms of what's next, there's sort of two aspects from my team's perspective. So for the ERIS program, we're looking more and more to work with sort of the concepts and detailed designs around commercial and business model toolkit, and actually applying that now to some of the projects, and actually looking at identifying some of these risks and where commercial opportunities lie, very much in sort of partnership with some of the stuff Sarah was talking out from our markets policy and regulation team. That hopefully then delivers some long-term insight for others, which can be used to try and take this model and try and prove and test how it could be commercially viable. And for new smart local energy systems, and we're currently in the process with working with a number of different sort of local authorities and service providers that are out there and trying to figure out how you make this a commercial reality. So we're sort of working through sort of different means of designing, testing, and evaluating different approaches and how they might work. And ultimately trying to utilize some of the internal Catapult experts around modeling, but consumer research to try and figure out how best to actually bring this concept to market.
Do you think smart local energy systems will deliver more value if they are publicly run, i.e. by a local authority, or privately run? Simon, what's your view on this?
Okay, so I mean, the obvious answer is it's a bit of both, unfortunately, but it is always likely to be a mix of sort of public and private investment that's likely to make this happen. I mean, the first aspect, which I think Sarah has touched on as well, is price signals are vital to making SLES a commercial reality. Local constraint management needs to be properly established as a market and properly priced to make private organizations want to participate, and I think that's a key first step. And a lot of the projects are looking about how to quantify that and make that happen. But there's also there's sort of intrinsic sort of social value and community value that potentially is difficult to price at this stage. And I suppose that's where we think it's important to have a strong public voice involved in all of these projects. Whether that's a local authority or community interest group, it seems really important that from kind of two aspects. One is there is someone there who's ultimately responsible, or their main or core objective is actually protecting local interests. But also just in terms of strategically trying to plan for that local area, whether it is a local authority should understand best in terms of where there's potentially some vulnerable customers or different sort of customer needs within the area, but also just planning in terms of understanding local constraints and understanding the local area is probably quite important too. So yeah, it always feels like in everything we've seen so far is sort of a partnership, and I do always think it will be a mix of sort of private and public that will make that happen. Software especially, I think, is a key thing that we've seen from a private perspective that's necessary. And if we do get into the likes of some of the things we see in Europe around municipalities taking on responsibility for generation and distribution and supply, they'll still need support, I think, and whether that's on billing or trading or some of the aggregation platforms, it is always probably going to be a combination of both.